Hello, welcome to the second instalment of our magisterial progress through Marxist capital. This is actually take two, take one you don't want to know about. So today we are talking about, and I've not got the PowerPoint up, theories of labour. So we're going to now disappear.
Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so right, so we're gonna concern ourselves today with theories of labour, but to recap slightly from last week, theories of labour are intimately connected up with theories of value because the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of labour power that is congealed inside it. And we're getting back to that idea a bit later on today as well. So the first thing that we need to know in relation to the general formula for capital is that there is a distinction between money as money and money as capital, because they're not the same thing. Right, so capital is money, according to Marx, that circulates. It's money that you launch into the form of circulation. So capital is money, but used in a certain way. So the first distinction between money and money as capital is nothing more than a difference in their form of circulation, as Marx writes on page 247. And he's got two formulas here for money in order to buy a commodity, which is that formula there on the top right hand side. So commodity, money, commodity, which is when you've got a commodity and you want to exchange it for something else, even though that passes through the medium of money, it's still the same thing. The money is withdrawn from the process of the market sphere because you want to buy a commodity, and that's where it ends. That's where the whole transaction ends with that commodity that you've bought. Marx uses the example of wine and corn, I think. So if you've got wine and you'd like to buy corn, if I exchange my wine and John gives me his corn, then that ends there. When I have my corn and John has his wine.
Nice.
Yes, so that's where that ends, right? That is not capital. Capital is the formula that Marx describes as money, commodity, money, but there are things that we need to get into there as well. But if you've got money, commodity, money, you're only interested in exchanging money for more money, which is not the formula that we've got here yet. But basically, you cut out the commodity because the only thing you're interested in is money. You're not interested, e.g., in the use value of the commodity that you buy, but you're only interested in the exchange value. It's the only thing you're interested in. Quite like the way that Marx on page 248 talks about money being set free. But yeah, so on page 249, actually, the second paragraph, or the third paragraph really, begins with, in the circulation, commodity, money, commodity. The money is in the end converted into a commodity which serves as a use value. It has therefore been spent once and for all. So that's when it ends. This process of exchange ends there. Right, okay. So to spend a bit more time on this equation there, money, commodity, money, I'll just read this quote first of all. This reflux of money to its starting point does not depend on the commodities being sold for more than was paid for it. That only has a bearing on the amount of money which flows back. The phenomenon of reflux itself takes place. I love that. The phenomenon of reflux takes place as soon as the purchased commodity is resold, i.e. as soon as the cycle MCM has been completed. We have therefore a palpable difference between the circulation of money as capital and its circulation as mere money, which is kind of what we've talked about before. That circulation, once you've got the commodity, is completed, but the circulation of money as capital, you're only interested in money itself. Weirdly, and this is where this kind of law of equivalence comes in, the first sentence of this passage is this reflux of money to its starting point does not depend on the commodities being sold for more than was paid for it, which is you pay exactly what the value of this commodity is, e.g. and the value of a commodity, to remember, is the amount of congealed labour power that's trapped inside it. So the whole Marx, what he's doing, and the whole kind of passages for today, is he is assuming, like the political economists that he's answering to and criticizing, he is assuming that the market works in an according to this law of equivalence. E.g., if I buy a commodity, I am not paying more or less than what it is worth. So I'm paying exactly what it is worth. So the merchant doesn't charge me more than it's worth. And if I'm the buyer of a commodity, I'm not charging more than it is worth. So it's this kind of idealized way of market relations that Marx presupposes here for the purpose of actually dismantling the whole process of market relations, because the second and third essays in reading for this week is actually all about exploitation, but he is kind of undermining the argument of the political economists that he's reading. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, great. So then, I mean, so Marx is saying, okay, there is no point if you have this formula money, commodity, money, or money for money, if there's not more money that comes out at the end of that process than you had at the beginning of the process of circulation, right? So let me just find this passage. Where he's talking about the absurdity. Page 251, he's talking to exchange £100 for cotton and to exchange the same cotton again for £100 is merely a roundabout way of exchanging money for money, the same for the same, and appears to be an operation as purposeless as it is absurd. So the point is that you can't, if you do this money, commodity money, if you're interested in money, you don't want to end up with the same £100 that you started out with, but you want to start out with £100 and get back £110 for you, right? So and the way that Marx notes that formula as money, commodity, and then delta money, or I don't know how you say this. Right, okay, so you want, and this is page 251, what you want is the original sum advanced plus an increment. And this increment or excess, e.g. delta money, is the original value, plus, which is called surplus value. Right, okay, so the simple circulation of commodities, selling in order to buy, is a means to a final goal which lies outside circulation, namely the appropriation of use values, the satisfaction of needs. As against this, the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself, for the valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore, with a spelling mistake there, limitless. Not spelling a type, whatever. Anyway, so that is just, again, if you have the simple circulation of commodities, so commodity, money, commodity, you're only interested in use value, e.g. the satisfaction of needs. As against this, you've got the circulation of money as capital, e.g. money, commodity, delta money, that's an end in itself, and that only occurs when you constantly throw money into the circulation process. And this movement, as Marx chillingly says, this movement of capital is limitless. And capital, if you recall, is value in motion. It's value in constant motion, because if you, and he's got this example of a hoarder, a miser, who hoards money, that is not capital, because you're just saving it. You're sort of saving it from circulation. That is not capital. You're just hoarding treasure, as it were, but you're not investing it in the circulation process. And so, in order for capital to work, the whole point is that it's constantly moving. If you listen to David Harvey, he's talking about this idea of like, you can't say capital is a thing. You can't just say, ah, that's capital, but it is something that always and only exists in ceaseless motion. Now, on page 252, he's talking about this being concerned with the valorization, the Verwertung of value, and that the only thing you're interested in is this idea, again, very chillingly, of absolute wealth. And that brings him to this amazing quotations here that is on page 253, which is that the movement of capital is limitless. And in Grundrisse, this is a picture from Terminator, in which I think articulates and shows very clearly what the movement of limitless capital leads to, e.g. The scorched earth. In Grundrisse, Marx writes about how capitalism cannot abide a limit, which is why all this kind of vampiric rhetoric also comes from, because it does not, capitalism and capital cannot and does never conceives of ever wanting to stop. It's about total exsanguination. This absolute wealth is also about total exsanguination. So again, if you have, when you think about the crises of capitalism, I put that short animation of David Harvey's there on Mole. You should check it out. What he's saying in that is that capitalism never solves its crises, but it only shoves them off into a different geographical area. It's only 11 minutes, and it sort of articulates perfectly what capital and capitalism does. It breaking away from limits, because all it wants to do is expand. And if you think about like this rhetoric of growth that is all pervasive in today's culture, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about constant growth, and it strives towards this absolute wealth and limitless growth. Page 254, he's going further into all this, talks about all this unceasing movement of capital. You have to seek to expand. It's a cancer as well. Capital is cancer. And it's about the ceaseless augmentation of value. Right, okay, so we have established that capitalism and capital is cancerous. We're moving on now. We're moving on to the next chapter, chapter 5, Contradictions in the General Formula. And basically the question that Marx is solving to, he's posing and then solving is where does surplus value, e.g. profit, come from? And what he's doing, he's just going through the historical conditions here a little bit. He's in order to think where does it come from, and he's saying, well, surplus value cannot exist outside of circulation if this law of equivalence is preserved. And he's talking here because he says, well, you know, in a culture of where which is kind of based around slavery, you don't have that equivalence, that law of equivalence, because you're obviously not free to sell your labor power in the market, right? And the first few pages are all about various kind of hypotheses that Marx goes through in order to prove that the surplus value cannot be created outside of circulation, e.g. it can't be created on the marketplace, because the marketplace sort of presupposes that you exchange a commodity for what it is worth. So if to understand it a little bit better, just look at this pages 263, particularly up until 266, where he goes into the details of why it can't exist outside of circulation. At the same time, he says surplus value can't exist inside of circulation either, because value cannot be created by the market exchange. What the market exchange does is it might redistribute value, but it can't create value. So as long as equivalents are exchanged, this is always a sort of presupposition here, this law of equivalence. As long as equivalents are exchanged, surplus cannot come from either selling your commodity too cheaply, too expensively, or it can't be created from the process of exchange in itself, precisely because you're kind of assuming that you're only exchanging equivalents. Right. This is again something that he looks at on page 267, and he then goes into the differences between earlier forms of capitalism. So he talks about usurer's capital, which is sort of merchant capital, and obviously merchant capitalism worked on the assumption that you plunder the rest of the world, which can only go so far. Right. So, hang on, let me just see what the next slide is. Sorry, I'm just thinking.
You're allowed to think.
Hang on. So he says, the top of page 268, which is slightly before this kind of slide here. So top of page 268, we have shown that surplus value cannot arise from circulation, and therefore that for it to be formed, something must take place in the background, which is not visible in the circulation itself. And then he says, outside circulation, the commodity owner only stands in relation to his own commodity. As far as the value of that commodity is concerned, the relation is limited to this, that the commodity contains a quantity of his own labour which is measured according to definite social laws. This is what he's concerned about here. It's according to these definite social laws, you can't sell your commodity for more expensive than it is, because it would mess up this kind of law of equivalency of the market. What he then says is, like, the only way, or the only reason or place where surplus value can be created is in the process of production, e.g. it is the labour power that creates surplus value, right? So the commodity owner can create, oh hang on, am I citing this? No. The commodity owner can create value by his labour. So that leads us to that quotation on that page 270 there, which is the next chapter, chapter 6, the sale and purchase of labour power. So the only way that surplus power can be created is through labour power. So the change in value, e.g. the acquisition of surplus value, can therefore originate only in the actual use value of the commodity, i.e. in its consumption. In order to extract value of the consumption of a commodity, our friend the money owner must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation on the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being the source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labour, hence a creation of value. The possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labour, in other words, labour power. So, in order for surplus value to be created, the capitalist must find a commodity on the marketplace which has more value, or is able to produce more value than it itself consumes. And that is all about sustenance. So the labour power, remember, is a commodity. The power that you offer, the labour power that you offer, makes you into a commodity. And in order for you to be able to work, you must eat, you must find shelter, you must have clothing. So that's the means of sustenance, which actually, is the next thing. So the capitalist pays you your
That was the phone. I've just, yeah, carry on.
So hang on, let me just have a drink of water here. Drink of wine.
I'll eat my corn.
So where was I? So in order for you to produce work, you must eat. Oh Jesus.
Hi Bob, can I call you back? We're recording the podcast, so it's okay. I should have. Yeah. Okay. Cheers, Bob. Bye. Yeah. Continue, Fabienne. We're not redoing it now.
No. Okay. So, if I want to sell my labor to the capitalist, and I must sell my labor to the capitalist, I need to eat, because otherwise my labor power is very quickly depleted and I'll die. If I don't eat, if I don't have shelter, if I don't have clothing, I can't live. So the capitalist must pay me in order to sustain myself. So labor power exists only as a capacity of the living individual. Okay, does that make sense? Because I kind of, yeah.
If it doesn't, we can go over it again. So
Yeah.
that's fine. Let's march on.
Okay, let's march on. Right. Okay. So basically, that means that I have to have a minimum wage. There has to be a minimum amount that I get from the capitalist in order that I can produce his products for him. So the ultimate or minimum limit of the the ultimate or minimum limit of the value of labor power is formed by the value of the commodities which have to be supplied every day to the bearer of labor power, the man, so that he can renew his life processes. So basically, I need a certain amount of commodities in order to live. That is like this ultimate or minimum limit of the value of labor power is the minimum number of commodities I have to have in order to live, eat, and in order to live, e.g. in order to work to produce the commodities for the man, the capitalist. So the surplus value, as Marx comes to realize in this chapter, happens inside the means of production. So e.g. where I work. So inside the factory, on the fields, wherever I might work, that's where the creation of value, of surplus value, happens. And the way that happens is that the capitalist pays me my means of sustenance, say, and that takes 3 hours of my working day, and that means my means of sustenance is paid for by the capitalist, but my working day consists of 5 more hours. In those 5 more hours, I produce surplus value for the capitalist. So I'll spend a bit more time on that in terms of like what Marx also says is that it's very difficult to say where like surplus value begins, e.g. where I stop working off what the capitalist gives me in terms of means of sustenance, and where I start producing his surplus value for him basically for free. It's very difficult to say where that begins and where that ends. But that leads into the whole next passages on the struggle for the working day. And Marx at some point says that you can conceive of the labor of the day that you do of like working 30 seconds per minute to work off the means of sustenance, and 30 seconds of that minute where you produce surplus value for the capitalist. But you can't for sure tell you where the one thing ends and where the other thing begins. What else did I want to say on that note? I can't remember. But so the next chapters, which I'm not going to talk too much about, but we're going to ask you to do stuff for workshop tasks. The chapter 7 there, the labor process and the process of producing surplus value, is all about how actually, it's kind of reminding us of the power of labor, which obviously has been more or less totally destroyed by Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s. But what Marx is doing us, and you might find that kind of rhetoric quite problematic as well, is the power that we have in transforming the world. And he obviously talks about that in relation to nature, but what he also does here in this chapter is to develop this idea of man as a species being. And he's talking about all this kind of potentiality that slumbers within living labor. And there's all this rhetoric here, or these metaphors, I should say, of werewolves and vampires, because living labor depletes itself for the capitalist. And it, to go back to last week's reading, it congeals in the object, and as a relation, the social relations between people change, because we only see that as relations between things. And the final chapter there that we asked you to look at, the working day, is basically about the degree of exploitation of the worker by the capitalist as a result of this hunger and bloodthirst for the creation of surplus value. Okay, so I'm going to stop here.
So my role, quite briefly, is just to return to the idea of limits that Fabienne's already mentioned, with a view to setting up the tasks that we're going to be involved with in the workshop next week. So in thinking about limits, I want to think about 4 different kinds of limits, or 4 different ways of approaching the idea of the limit, which is to say I'm thinking about 4 materialities, and I've returned to that quotation that Fabienne's already given us. The movement of capital is therefore limitless. The idea of limits is anathema to the idea of capitalism. The first most obvious limit for capital is the bounds of terrestrial life. So here we've got this very alarming photograph of the end of the world, because of course capitalism is bounded by the ultimate fact that we are limited to life on Earth. We may perhaps colonize other planets in the fullness of time, but now we are bound by the possibilities of what we can do on planet Earth. And this returns to a topic we talked about last week, about the idea of reality. So if the Earth is the ultimate grounds of reality, then that is one way of thinking about limits, and that the mysteriousness and the impossibility of capitalism exists in this clash between its limitlessness and the idea of the inevitable limit of living on a finite planet. So one limit, nature. Another limit is the body. So I'm going to be picking up on ideas of the minimum wage and the idea of the way in which, if capitalism relies on labour, there are limits to what it can do in the body of the worker. Connected to this, 2 things that are encapsulated in the slide in the bottom corner there, both time and mechanisation. The amount of time in a day is obviously limited, and the way that this is understood, and also the body is understood, and how the planet is understood in terms of the limits of capital, takes us towards questions of technology as well, which will be the last thing that I'll be talking about. So just really quickly, to offer a few provocations based on Marx's thought here. So the first limit, nature. The soil in which in the virgin state in which it supplies man with necessaries or the means of subsistence ready to hand, exists independently of him and is the universal subject of human labour. So the quite straightforward point I want to emphasise here is the idea that the soil, the natural world, exists independently of man and independent of whatever ideological system we wish to live in. So this is why ecology, the natural world, must inevitably be understood in any reasonable, sane politics as the ultimate reality, the ultimate grounds, the ultimate soil of existence. Any other cultural reality is always a secondary reality. So everything is based on the possibilities of life on the planet. And this is the universal subject of human labour. This is what labour always returns to, the relationship between enterprise, between labour and the earth as the ultimate material grounds of our existence. So that's limit number 1. Limit number 2, time. So the image I've got here is of a 19th century railway timetable. So time, in a sense, came to exist as we understand it in the 19th century, in the period in which Marx, Darwin and Freud are writing. So time only becomes standardized with the invention of the railways in Britain in the 19th century. So different towns, sometimes not particularly far apart, would have different times. There was no need for them to be standardized. But when railways connect towns, then there becomes this need to have every clock telling the same time. So the clock for the first time in Leeds reads the same as the clock in Sheffield. So time comes into existence. So time, we might think of it as a given, as natural or beyond ideology, but in actual fact time is constructed in the 19th century, which is not to say that there aren't obviously very large empirical reasons why time exists, as in day, night, the seasons, years, but time is constructed in relation to the rise of capital, specifically the development of railways in the 19th century. So time is one limiting factor that capitalism in its endless expansion is necessarily involved with. So another quotation from Marx: we started with the supposition that labour is bought and sold at its value. Its value is determined by the working time necessary to its production. So any theory of capital is involved with the question of how much you can achieve in a certain period of time. So time as a limit, but also in response to those limits, time is something that's invented by capitalism in order to try and transcend or to maximise those limits applied by the working day, and also, of course, by the worker's body in relation to time. Your body can only achieve so much. So capitalism is always necessarily a discourse of the body, and there's plenty of references to the body in the passages of Marx that we're looking at this week. So another quotation from Marx here: the second essential condition which allows the owner of money to find the labour power in the market as a commodity is this, that the possessor of labour power, instead of being able to sell commodities in which his labour has been objectified, must rather be compelled to offer for sale as a commodity that very labour power that exists only in his living body. So your body itself is a commodity. So you can exchange your labour for money in order to buy commodities, the CMC that Fabienne began with a few minutes ago. So the minimum wage is the lowest point at which the body can operate to allow it to function in capitalism. And the minimum wage actually is as a legally enshrined thing, is actually quite a relatively recent phenomenon. My first job was £1.55 an hour, and obviously this varies from region to region. The idea of the minimum wage doesn't exist in many cultures or many countries, which is why Primark clothes are manufactured in Bangladesh, for example, with much lower living conditions, much worse employment conditions, with obviously very significant effects on the bodies of the workers and what we consider as minimum welfare standards. All of this tells us that all that is solid melts into air, a very famous quotation from Marx and Engels' 1848 Communist Manifesto. Everything that is real, the body, the earth, time, dissipates into this imaginary world that capitalism is. And I think whatever your own ideological persuasions, however you respond to the material of this course, I would say that this is an unnegotiable truth, that capitalism is an invention. It is the process of making things that are vaporous appear to be solid. My final materiality that follows on from that is the idea of the machine or technology, which is a way of thinking about how we might reinvent or transcend those three grounds of existence. And another way of thinking about this would be an idea that's become known as transhumanism, the idea that the human might be perfected in order to produce a more perfect system. So we can move beyond the Earth to build nuclear power stations on the moon, or we can improve the body to operate in more efficient ways, or we can find ways of fitting more into the working day. So technology is always involved in transcending terrestrial bodily temporal limits. Technology obviously appears quite a lot in Marx's writing. I just wanted to finish with one provocation on this, which I think I've mentioned Samuel Butler before, but a favourite quotation of mine from Samuel Butler, who's a novelist, evolutionary theorist, thinker, and a gay shepherd from the middle of the 19th century. And he wrote this amazing article called Darwin Among the Machines, in which he says, day by day, however, the machines are gaining ground upon us. Day by day, we're becoming more subservient to them. More men are daily bound down as slaves to tend them. More men are daily devoting the energies of their whole lives to the development of mechanical life. Ponder what your relationship with machines in your life is. Is it one of dominance or one of subservience? And ponder how that might relate to Marx's thought as well. Last slide. So this is the task. Based on those four materialities and the context that Fabian was giving before, think about nature, time, the body, machines. What does Marx have to say about them? And in order to facilitate the conversation in class, select a relevant passage from this week's reading for each of those themes, annotate that passage, prepare some thoughts to share with the group about each of those material limits and how it features in Marx's thought. The end.
Okay, that's it for us this week. So in solidarity until next week.
Yep, bye.
Bye.